Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this really profound expectation of precision.
Right. It feels almost like engineering in a way.
Exactly. I mean, if you fall off a ladder and break your arm, you go to the hospital and they put you in an X-ray machine.
And just a few minutes later, the doctor points to a backlit screen.
Yeah, you see that jagged white line on the bone, and the doctor just points and says, well, there it is.
It's binary.
That's
I mean, it is either broken or it isn't.
Totally. And that binary is deeply comforting to us. We like things to be visible.
We really do.
We like them to be cleanly categorized, where the problem is obvious and the solution, like putting on a cast, maybe getting your friends to sign it, is just straightforward.
Because that fits really neatly into a protocol. The system knows exactly what to do with a broken bone.
Right. But then you step into the world of internal medicine or, infectious disease, and suddenly that X-ray machine is pretty much useless.
Completely useless.
Yeah. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, quite honestly, incredibly murky. And that murkiness, that profound need to see clearly, when the biological systems inside us, and frankly the institutional systems around us, are failing, that's exactly what we are navigating today.
It really is.
So welcome to the Deep Dive. We are thrilled you're joining us today. We are exploring the true definition of critical thinking.
Which is a lot more complex than it sounds.
Oh, absolutely. We're going to look at how this incredibly rare trait shapes paradigm-shifting historical figures, and more pressingly, how it manifests right now in the story of a modern medical whistleblower, Dr. Kadiyali Srivatsa.
And it is a journey that connects some incredibly disparate worlds. I mean, the stakes of understanding this connection are, frankly, existential.
They really are. To explore this, we're pulling from a really vast array of data for you today.
Yeah, it's a huge stack of sources.
We're looking at the 2023 Future of Jobs report. We've got evolutionary analyses of historical figures, deeply technical computer science models on artificial intelligence.
We're also digging into institutional reports concerning the UK's National Health Service.
Right, and some profoundly personal philosophical frameworks touching on concepts like Dharma and the Kalki avatar.
And our mission today is really to connect all those dots. We need to understand how a catastrophic failure of critical thinking at the institutional level has basically led us to the brink of a global antimicrobial resistance crisis.
Often referred to as AMR.
Exactly. And the models predict this is going to hit critical mass by 2028.
Which is just right around the corner.
It is. But crucially, we are also going to explore how a radical AI-driven decentralized solution might literally be our only way out of this.
It's super intense material. Now, before we get into the biology of superbugs or the mechanics of artificial intelligence, I just want to set a clear ground rule for our conversation today.
Good idea.
As we unpack this, and I want to emphasize this to you listening, some of the claims we are exploring regarding medical institutions and government policies are pretty explosive.
Very much so.
Our role here is to impartially follow the data and the philosophical arguments where they lead. We aren't here to endorse specific political viewpoints or, attack specific organizations or take any sides.
Right. Our goal is strictly to explore these profound, often really challenging ideas presented in the data and just understand the logic behind them.
Exactly, which is an essential mindset to adopt because true critical thinking often looks exactly like rebellion.
It does, because institutions, by their very nature, they demand conformity. They require standardization just to maintain order.
But biological survival demands adaptation. And right now, we are facing a biological enemy in the form of superbugs that is adapting exponentially faster than our rigid, bureaucratic healthcare systems can actually handle.
Okay, so let's unpack this concept of critical thinking first, because the data we're looking at just reframes it completely.
Yeah, I think most people, myself included, honestly usually think of critical thinking as just, being highly educated, right?
Right, like getting good grades, passing advanced exams, maybe holding a prestigious degree.
Exactly. But the 2023 Future of Jobs report points to a massive fundamental flaw in how we educate people. They argue that the focus has to aggressively shift from what to think to how to think.
Yes, it's the distinction between knowledge accumulation and actual problem formulation.
Right.
And to really understand that, we have to look at the philosophical framework underlying this whole discussion. Thinkers like J. Krishnamurti draw a very hard, brilliant line between intellect and intelligence.
Let's define those terms because they sound like synonyms to most people. But in this context, they are basically complete opposites. So how do they define intellect?
Well, intellect is mechanical. It is the capacity to memorize rules, to pass standardized tests, and to engineer systems based entirely on existing blueprints.
So it's algorithmic.
Completely. And crucially, it is entirely driven by a system of reward and punishment.
Like getting an A on a test or, I don't know, a promotion at work.
Exactly. And because it is driven by reward and punishment, intellect naturally breeds this intense desire for conformity. Intellect wants to fit in.
It wants the approval of the institution.
Right. Intelligence, on the other hand, is defined here as the unconditioned awareness of life.
Unconditioned awareness.
Yeah. It is the ability to see things exactly as they are, without the filter of fear, without societal programming, and without that desperate need for institutional approval.
Wow.
Intelligence is what allows you to formulate a completely new problem rather than just solving an old problem with some memorized formula.
So how does that actually manifest in the real world? Let's look at history for a second.
Okay.
Take Charles Darwin.
Okay.
We have this highly romanticized image of him as this lone genius,
Yeah.
right? You know, the tortured soul standing on the bow of the HMS Beagle, staring at a finch in the Galapagos,
Yeah.
and having a sudden, completely original epiphany just out of nowhere.
Right, the light bulb moment.
Yeah. But the historical analysis completely dismantles that myth.
Mm.
Darwin wasn't pulling ideas from a vacuum.
Not at all. The data argues that copying and variation are actually the very heart of Darwin's theory of evolution.
Which is so poetic.
It is. And ironically, his own intellectual process perfectly mirrored his theory. He was what historians call a magpie genius.
A magpie genius.
Yeah,
Which basically means he was a synthesizer.
exactly.
I mean, he looked at Thomas Malthus's economic theories on population growth and starvation. Then he looked at Charles Lyell's geological theories about the Earth changing slowly over immense periods of time.
And he synthesized them. He took these existing, seemingly disconnected truths and combined them to explain biological adaptation.
So, wait, we usually picture a genius as a tortured soul in a dark room coming up with something entirely new. But the sources are saying true critical thinking is actually more like being a DJ.
A DJ? I like that.
Yeah, you know, you take existing tracks, look at the patterns, and remix them to solve a what kind of problem.
Yes, that's a perfect analogy. Confirming this, real critical thinking requires shedding what sociologists call the sociological immune system.
The sociological immune system. That's a fascinating phrase.
It's the deep-seated evolutionary fear of not fitting in with your tribe or your peers.
Right, the fear of being outcast.
Exactly. When you shed that fear, you are finally free to look at reality impartially. You aren't inventing from a vacuum. You are remixing reality without the burden of institutional dogma.
It makes me think of other historical figures who challenged the status quo.
Yeah.
Take someone like Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. We rightly revere him as a visionary, but
Mhm.
fundamentally, he was an extraordinary synthesizer, a critical thinker in this exact mold.
How so?
Well, he took Mahatma Gandhi's mechanics of nonviolent resistance from India, and he brilliantly synthesized them with the theology and the rhetorical tradition of the American Black Church.
Ah, I see.
He wasn't inventing the concept of protest. He was intelligently synthesizing existing frameworks to challenge the deep institutional conformity of his time.
That is a perfect parallel. Whether it's biology or social justice, the pattern holds up.
Yeah.
The critical thinker observes the reality, identifies the systemic failure, synthesizes a new approach, and then pushes back against an institution that desperately wants them to just conform.
And this perfectly bridges the gap to the modern subject of our analysis, Dr. Kadiyali Srivatsa, or Dr. Sri, as he is often called in the documents.
Right. Here is where the rubber meets the road in modern medicine.
We aren't just talking about abstract philosophy anymore. We're talking about a physician with 50 years of clinical experience, including decades working deep inside the UK's National Health Service.
But to understand his approach to medicine, to understand why he didn't just conform to the mechanical intellect of that hospital system, we really have to look at his foundation.
Because he isn't just a product of modern Western medical schooling, is he?
No, not at all. His work is directly connected to the ancient legacy of Acharya Charaka.
For those unfamiliar, who was Acharya Charaka?
He was a 2nd century BCE physician in ancient India who essentially codified medicine for humanity.
Wow.
The text he authored, the Charaka Samhita, is one of the foundational texts of Ayurveda. But it wasn't just, a medical manual. It was a profound ethical treatise.
Yeah.
Charaka operated on a core philosophy that medical knowledge absolutely must be used for the ethical service of humanity, entirely devoid of greed or institutional self-preservation.
And Dr. Shree's background is incredibly steeped in this exact philosophy. The sources detail how he carries a 600-year Sringeri Matha lineage,
Yes.
which is deeply connected to the Uluru Kartikeya temple tradition. And in that specific tradition, the deity Kartikeya actually serves as the divine physician.
Now, you listening might be wondering, why does this matter?
Yeah, exactly. It matters because this background isn't just biographical trivia. It's the operating system of his entire worldview.
Right.
He views himself not just as an employee of a hospital, clocking in and out,
Yeah.
but as a modern guardian of complex knowledge, carrying ancestral duty.
What is known in the philosophy as a dharma.
Yes, his dharma to protect humanity.
But philosophical lineage, no matter how profound it is, usually remains totally theoretical until it hits a catalyst, a breaking point.
And the data points to a highly specific, totally devastating moment that acted as the emotional and professional anchor for everything Dr. Shree did next.
It happened in December of 1989.
Let's talk about that night, because reading the clinical accounts, it is just heartbreaking.
It really is.
According to the sources, a completely healthy 14-year-old boy walks into an accident and emergency department. He isn't showing signs of catastrophic trauma.
Right, he walked in under his own power.
Yeah, but that very same evening, literally just hours later, that boy dies holding Dr. Srivatsa's hand.
You can just feel the sheer weight and the trauma of that moment echoing through all of his subsequent work.
Absolutely.
That tragedy fundamentally shattered Dr. Shree's faith in the mechanical intellect of the modern medical system.
It feels like that moment flipped a switch in him.
He realized in that moment that the scientific and medical community had become entirely preoccupied with whether they could do something.
Like whether they could perform a specific test or administer a specific chemical.
Right. Run a specific protocol without ever pausing to ask if they should. They were just following algorithms, not treating a human being.
Instead of seeing the patient as just, the 14-year-old male in bed 3 with symptom X, he actually saw the human.
Yes.
He recognized the failure of what the analytical frameworks in our sources call statistical morality. And we really need to explain this concept deeply because it affects every single person listening to this.
It's crucial.
What does statistical morality actually mean for you when you walk through the automatic sliding doors of a modern hospital?
Well, statistical morality is the practice of treating human beings as averages. It is essentially medicine based on the bell curve.
Okay, right.
When a system operates on statistical morality, the very moment you enter, you are stripped of your individual identity. You just become a chart number. You become a diagnosis.
So you aren't a person anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The doctors and nurses are trained to manage your vitals according to a rigid pre-written algorithm based on what works for the average person in a clinical trial.
So if the protocol says, give drug X for symptom Y because it works 85% of the time, the system doesn't care if you are in the 15% where it might be totally fatal.
Nope. The doctor's job is simply to execute the protocol.
Wow. And Dr. Shree argues that this mechanistic approach strips the patient of their free will and their fundamental humanity.
And worse, it absolves the doctor of having to use their intelligence. If the patient dies, but the doctor followed the protocol perfectly, the institution protects the doctor.
The system says, well, we did everything right.
Exactly. But the 14-year-old boy is still dead.
And Dr. Shree realized that to prevent unnecessary deaths, he couldn't rely on the mechanical intellect of the system anymore. He had to apply true critical intelligence.
Right, to identify the unique, subtle patterns of illness in individuals before they escalated to a fatal point.
Which is exactly what led to his early innovations in the 1980s and 90s. I mean, decades before AI was even a buzzword in healthcare. He developed something called the Pediatric Assessment Triangle, or PT.
Yes.
How did that actually work?
It was a visual flowchart-based symptom and sign system, and it was designed to rapidly differentiate serious, life-threatening illnesses from minor ones.
So it wasn't relying on, expensive lab work.
No, it didn't rely on expensive labs or complex technology at all. It relied on training junior doctors to observe 3 key things: the child's appearance, their work of breathing, and their circulation to the skin.
Just pure pattern recognition.
Yes. It was forcing clinicians to use active clinical reasoning and observation rather than blindly waiting for a protocol to tell them what to do.
But, applying independent clinical reasoning inside a massive, heavily bureaucratized institution is a really dangerous game.
Oh, absolutely.
When you stop acting like a cog in the machine tends to notice.
It definitely noticed.
And that brings us to the massive collision course detailed in the historical analysis of the UK's healthcare system in the early 2000s. This is the moment where critical intelligence directly threatens institutional intellect.
We really have to set the stage for what was happening in the UK around 2004. The government and the NHS were under immense political pressure. Wait times at hospitals were just soaring, budgets were heavily strained, and the public was really angry.
So to solve this, they launched a nurse-led practice pilot program. This was initiated in Woking, in Surrey.
Yeah.
The stated goal from the ministers was to reduce the intense pressure on doctors and walk-in centers by shifting the diagnostic and prescribing responsibilities directly to nurses.
Now, on paper, if you're an administrator with an MBA, just looking at a spreadsheet, that sounds incredibly efficient.
Oh, for sure. You have a bottleneck of doctors, so you just empower the nurses.
Right.
Problem solved, right?
But the clinical reality of this was absolutely terrifying. The fatal flaw was the training.
This part blew my mind.
These nurses, who had absolutely no formal medical school education, were given a mere 14 days of observational training.
Literally just 2 weeks of watching doctors work.
That's it. And after those 14 days, they were given the license to diagnose illnesses and prescribe antibiotics completely independently.
The contrast here is staggering, and it just highlights the deep institutional hypocrisy at play.
How so?
Well, think about the medical establishment, specifically the General Medical Council, or the GMC, which regulates doctors in the UK. They insist on incredibly strict, grueling rules for international doctors.
Oh, right. The POB test.
Exactly. If an incredibly experienced doctor from India wants to practice in the UK, they have to pass the PLAB test.
And that takes years of preparation.
Years. It is an exhaustingly rigorous examination of clinical skills, medical knowledge, communication. It is actively designed to be a massive barrier to entry just to ensure quality.
Yet the exact same system allowed a nurse with no medical degree, no foundation in pharmacology or pathology, to act as an independent doctor after just 14 days of shadowing.
It's wild. And Dr. Sri was placed right in the middle of this powder keg. He was appointed as the trainer and clinical assessor for these nurse prescribers in the pilot program.
Right. And using that same critical intelligence, that unconditioned awareness we talked about, he observed the pilot and immediately identified a pattern of absolute disaster.
What did he see?
He saw repeated clinical errors. He saw severe misdiagnoses. And most alarmingly, he documented the wildly inappropriate, massive overprescribing of antibiotics.
Which makes sense, because a nurse with 14 days of training doesn't have the deep clinical knowledge to distinguish between, say, a viral infection, which antibiotics do absolutely nothing for, and a bacterial infection.
Exactly. When in doubt, they just prescribe.
And Dr. Sri didn't stay quiet. He acted as a classic whistleblower.
He did. He raised the alarm clinically, ethically, and professionally.
He formally argued that offering healthcare based on rigid, simplified algorithms and protocols to make up for a complete lack of education is fundamentally unsafe.
He went so far as to publicly label the licensing of untrained personnel to diagnose and prescribe as quackery.
Wow. Now, this is the classic whistleblower trap. He's standing in the middle of a crowded room screaming that the building is on fire. He's providing the data.
And the management responds by firing him for making too much noise and disturbing the other guests.
Exactly. But we have to ask why. Why would institutions like the GMC, the British Medical Association, and the Royal College's institutions, whose literal mandate is to protect public health, ignore a glaring warning about a massive threat to patient safety?
It comes down to systemic cognitive biases, specifically anchoring and confirmation bias, mixed with just raw institutional self-preservation.
Right.
The administrators and managers running these trusts, many of whom, remember, have business degrees rather than medical training, they prioritized throughput, efficiency targets, and protecting the new system they had just heavily funded and staked their careers on.
So they angered themselves to the idea that the pilot had to be a success no matter what.
Precisely. So instead of investigating the very real documented risk to the patients walking into those clinics, they just activated their bureaucratic machinery to protect the status quo.
They closed ranks to protect the institution and the fellow healthcare workers from public scrutiny.
And Dr. Sri uses a powerful philosophical term from his lineage to describe this behavior.
Adharma.
Adharma, can you break that down?
Well, dharma is your fundamental duty to truth and the protection of life. Adharma is the exact opposite. It means ignoring wrongdoing, willfully concealing the truth, and failing in your ethical duty, all simply to preserve the system and protect your own career.
And the retaliation against Dr. Sri for exposing this adharma was incredibly swift, bureaucratic, and just brutal.
We really need to explain exactly how that retaliation works,
Yeah.
because it's insidious.
It is. It's not like they just fired him and he went to work at another hospital across town. When a regulatory body like the GMC turns against you, they have tools that can systematically destroy your life.
Walk us through what actually happened to him.
Okay, so starting in 2009, he was systematically blocked from working anywhere in the NHS. His income was completely and suddenly stopped.
Just cut off.
Yeah. But here is the truly Machiavellian part. The GMC investigated him and found absolutely no clinical evidence to remove his name from the medical register. Because they couldn't prove he was a bad doctor, because he wasn't.
Exactly. His medical license remained perfectly intact. But they placed a public notice on his profile stating he was under investigation.
Which is a career death sentence.
It really is a permanent black mark. If a hospital sees that you are under investigation by the GMC, they will not hire you. It's a huge liability risk.
So the institution effectively blacklisted him, cutting off his livelihood entirely without ever having to actually prove he did anything wrong in a transparent hearing.
Yeah, he endured nearly a decade of professional isolation, public humiliation, and total financial ruin. He had to fight back through the incredibly slow, expensive legal system.
And he took his case all the way to the High Court, didn't he?
He did, and eventually to the Supreme Court, where he finally won a definitive victory in 2018. The courts completely vindicated him. But the personal trauma, the years of his life stolen from him, it's staggering.
It's a massive toll. And while he was fighting for his professional life in the courts, trapped in legal bureaucracy, the very biological reality he was warning about in 2004 was quietly, exponentially multiplying.
Yes. The inappropriate overprescription of antibiotics by improperly trained staff using flawed protocols was fueling an existential global threat. Which brings us to the 2028 escalation.
This is where the story shifts from a tragic legal battle to a literal global biological emergency.
The data draws a direct, undeniable line between the systemic failures Dr. Sri identified in the Woking pilot in 2004 and today's antimicrobial resistance crisis, AMR.
Now, AMR is a term that gets thrown around a lot in public health, but we really need to understand the mechanism. How does a superbug actually work?
Let's get into the biology, because I think a lot of people just assume AMR means you might need a slightly stronger pill for a sinus infection, or maybe you have to take an antibiotic for 14 days instead of 7.
Right, they think it's just an inconvenience.
Exactly. They don't realize the sheer scale of the microscopic war that's actually happening.
Well, bacteria are not static. They are incredibly ancient, highly adaptable organisms.
Right.
When you expose a colony of bacteria to an antibiotic, especially inappropriately, like prescribing it for a viral infection where it just attacks the body's natural flora, you create immense evolutionary pressure.
So most of the bacteria die, obviously.
Yes, but a tiny fraction might have a random genetic mutation that allows them to survive. For example, some bacteria develop efflux pumps.
What exactly is an efflux pump?
It's literally a microscopic pump on the cellular membrane of the bacteria.
No.
When the antibiotic molecule enters the bacterial cell to kill it, the efflux pump recognizes the drug and immediately spits it back out before it can do any damage.
That is terrifyingly efficient.
Well, it gets worse.
Yeah.
Bacteria can actually share these resistance traits with each other.
Wait, really? How?
They do this through a process called horizontal gene transfer. They can physically connect to another bacterium and pass a plasmid, which is a small ring of DNA containing the genetic code for that efflux pump, right over to their neighbor.
So they are literally teaching each other how to survive our weapons.
Exactly.
And Dr. Sri foresaw what the clinical models call the superbug crisis. This is a scenario where microorganisms don't just survive our drugs. They actively exploit our genetic vulnerabilities faster than we can invent new chemicals.
And the World Health Organization sounded a massive alarm about this back in 2017.
Yes, they published a list of 12 distinct families of bacteria and fungi that are rapidly becoming pan-resistant. That means they are untreatable by any known antibiotic.
None of them work. To grasp the real-world scale of this, the analysis provides a brilliant but totally chilling analogy.
Let's hear it.
Imagine the USS Abraham Lincoln. It's a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. It basically operates as a floating city with a crew of around 5,000 sailors.
Okay, got it.
Now, imagine if just one single sailor gets a seemingly minor infection, a scrape on their knee, maybe a mild sore throat, but it turns out to be an AMR superbug.
Oh, man. It's not just a problem for that one sailor, is it?
Not at all. The lives of all 5,000 sailors on board are immediately at risk because they live in this closed, highly connected environment.
Right, there's no going anywhere.
Exactly. That infected sailor has to be completely quarantined. The medical bay has to try to use extremely rare, highly toxic last resort drugs. The operational capacity of the entire multi-billion-dollar ship is compromised by a single microscopic organism that learned how to spit out penicillin.
Now, take that aircraft carrier analogy and apply it to a major metropolitan hospital.
The stakes are astronomical.
The epidemiological models predict a breaking point, a total systemic crisis, by the year 2028. We are talking about the very near future.
It's basically tomorrow in terms of public health planning.
Yeah. The models state that the risk of untreatable AMR infections spreading within hospital walls will become so extreme that it will fundamentally alter human behavior.
Specifically, the behavior of the healthcare workers themselves.
Right. Think about it. If you are a nurse or a doctor, and you know that walking into the ICU means a high probability of contracting an airborne or surface-transmitted infection that simply cannot be cured by any medicine on Earth, your willingness to go to work just plummets.
They will refuse to risk their own lives, and you can't blame them. Who wants to walk into a burning building when there's no water in the hoses?
Exactly. And without staff, the hospitals just collapse. They
Right.
simply cannot operate. So what is the current institutional response to this looming disaster?
Well, true to form, the mechanical intellect of the system is just throwing money at a technological band-aid.
Of course they are.
National leaders, public health officials, and device manufacturers are investing billions into standard AI, generic robotics, and what they call health ATMs or standard diagnostic kiosks.
Okay, let's talk about these kiosks, because this is the kiosk paradox, and it is honestly the most glaring logical failure in the entire institutional response.
It really is.
Because on the surface, placing automated diagnostic kiosks in hospitals to reduce human-to-human contact sounds smart, right?
Sure, it sounds like a logical technological step.
But the clinical analysis points out a terrifying fatal flaw. These standard machines are quite literally ticking time bombs.
Why? Because of the fundamental nature of an AMR superbug.
Right.
Standard medical kiosks use touch screens. They use physical blood pressure cuffs. They require the patient to breathe into proximity sensors.
And here's the terrifying truth. AMR infections are, by definition, fiercely resilient. They form biofilms on surfaces that are essentially immune to standard chemical cleaners.
They cannot be eradicated by weak chemicals, and they even survive strong chemical sterilization protocols.
So wait, we are building a digital bridge to safety, right? We are telling sick, potentially infectious people to go touch a screen in a hospital lobby.
Yes.
But the machine itself cannot be cleaned of superbugs. The very kiosks meant to triage patients will become contaminated with untreatable bacteria before they even begin operating properly.
It's completely counterproductive.
They will actively act as disease vectors, spreading the superbug to every subsequent patient who just touches the screen.
It is the ultimate failure of intellect. The tech companies building these standard machines are building them for profit maximization and throughput.
They are applying a consumer electronics mindset to an evolutionary biological crisis.
Exactly. And if we rely on that system, we will just accelerate the spread. We need a system fundamentally based on critical intelligence. We need a completely different architecture of patient-centered care.
But if standard kiosks are a contamination trap and hospitals are becoming danger zones, how do you actually solve this? I mean, if I get sick in 2028 and going to the clinic might kill me, what do I actually do?
It's the ultimate question.
And if a kiosk is supposedly the answer, how does Dr. Sri's proposed system not become the exact same ticking time bomb?
That brings us to the Dr. Maya AI healthcare ecosystem and the Prima kiosk.
Okay.
But to truly understand why the system works, we really have to look at the profound philosophical lens through which Dr. Sri views the entire AMR crisis.
Because he doesn't just see bacteria adapting, does he?
No, he frames the AMR superbug as the Kalki avatar.
Okay, wait. We need to pause here because I can just hear you listening and saying, wait a minute. We went from the rigorous biology of horizontal gene transfer to a Hindu theological concept of the apocalypse.
I know, it sounds like a massive leap.
Are we mapping a deity literally onto antibiotic resistance? Is he arguing this is actual intelligent design by the universe?
It's a Brilliant, vital question to ask, but no, he isn't talking about a literal god with a sword coming down from the clouds.
Okay.
He is using the Vedic philosophy of the Kalki avatar as a profound metaphorical and conceptual framework to understand evolutionary pressure.
Could you explain the Kalki avatar concept a bit more for context?
Sure. In Hindu tradition, the Kalki avatar is the final incarnation of the preserver deity Vishnu. Kalki arrives at the very end of an age of darkness and corruption known as the Kali Yuga. But its purpose is not evil. It is a destructive force of ultimate correction. It arrives to break corrupted matter down into atoms, to wipe out a profoundly unethical generation, and to restore dharma.
Cosmic balance, truth, and natural order.
Exactly.
So he is arguing that this superbug is essentially an intelligent evolutionary force of nature acting as a corrective mechanism.
Yes.
The medical system has operated with dharma, with mechanical greed, over-prescription, and that statistical morality we talked about, and nature is basically responding by rendering our weapons totally useless to force us back into balance.
Precisely. The bacteria are adapting to our misuse of medicine. And Dr. Shri argues that to survive this Kalki force, humanity simply cannot fight it with more adharma.
We can't just fight it with more brute force chemicals or mechanical profit-driven tech.
No. We must fundamentally change our behavior. We must transition to an ecosystem of absolute empathy and patient-centered care.
Which brings us back to the technology, the Dr. Maya AI and the Prima kiosk. How does this system actually solve the contamination paradox?
Let's break it down.
Yeah, how is it different from the black box AI and the standard touchscreens that will literally kill us?
Let's look at the UX and the engineering of the system. First, unlike standard AI that uses black box algorithms where the AI gives you a diagnosis but can't really explain how it arrived at it, the Dr. Maya GPT uses a highly intuitive, transparent, color-coded symptom triage system.
Oh, that is elegantly simple.
Very.
The sources say blue indicates an infection risk, red is an emergency, green means moderate concern, and yellow means self-care.
Exactly. It is designed to mimic the clinical reasoning of an experienced, critically thinking human doctor, much like Dr. Shri's early PAT system from the 80s, rather than a rigid statistical algorithm.
But the most revolutionary aspect is the physical deployment and the actual hardware of the Prima kiosks. It fundamentally solves the contamination paradox through decentralization and sterilization technology.
Okay, let's detail that. How does the Prima kiosk avoid becoming a superbug petri dish like the others?
First, they're not designed around touchscreens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the design accommodates touchless interfaces, advanced voice recognition, and thermal imaging. You just don't need to physically handle shared equipment to be triaged.
That's a huge shift right there.
Second, the environment of the kiosk incorporates automated self-sterilization protocols between users.
What kind of protocols?
They utilize technologies like UVC light cycles that actually destroy bacterial DNA and antimicrobial copper surfaces that actively break down biofilms.
So the machine physically protects itself.
Yes. But the real genius here seemed to be where the machines are actually located.
Exactly. This is the paradigm shift we desperately need.
Right.
Instead of waiting for a sick person to get on a public bus, walk into a crowded, centralized hospital waiting room, and cough on 30 other vulnerable people effectively acting as a superbug delivery mechanism, the Prima kiosks are deployed directly into the community.
They're basically outposts. The data describes them as solar-powered, completely independent units.
Which means they can go anywhere.
Anywhere. They are multilingual, capable of interacting in over 100 languages. And crucially, they are specifically built with user interfaces designed for the most vulnerable, even illiterate populations.
Think about that. How do you treat an illiterate population with a computer?
It's tough.
You use voice prompts in native dialects, you use universal pictograms, you use the color-coded light system we mentioned.
Right.
The user approaches the kiosk, interacts via voice and sensors, inputs their symptoms, and the AI triages them.
And if they hit that blue code indicating a high risk for a transmissible infection, the kiosk gives them immediate, actionable advice.
It tells them to isolate early in their own home. It might connect them to a remote telehealth doctor or dispense necessary non-antibiotic relief right there.
But the key is, it bypasses the need for an unnecessary, highly dangerous clinic visit entirely.
It stops the community spread of the superbug right at the source.
It keeps the hospital free of unnecessary traffic, reserving that highly sterile environment only for the absolute red emergencies.
It's decentralizing healthcare to protect the center. It's just brilliant.
It really is. But here's the massive hurdle, and I want to push back on this a bit. How do we get people to actually use this?
That's the million-dollar question.
We are talking about fundamentally changing human behavior on a global scale. How do you get a terrified mother with a sick child to trust a solar-powered box in her neighborhood instead of rushing to the emergency room, especially before that 2028 crisis point hits?
The models are very, very clear on this. Education and real-world validation must happen immediately. We simply cannot wait until 2028.
No, that would be too late.
People need to be taught to trust their own symptoms again. They need to be educated on how to use these tools, the Prima kiosks, the Dr. Maya apps, the accessible websites, before they are in a state of sheer panic.
And that is exactly what Dr. Sri is currently proposing. The documents we reviewed include a direct policy brief directed at UK ministers and public health officials.
And what's fascinating is what he isn't asking for.
Oh, totally. He isn't asking for a massive billion-dollar profitable procurement contract. He is asking for permission and support to run a tightly controlled ethical pilot program.
He just wants to deploy 50 Prima kiosks across a variety of UK communities, urban centers, suburban neighborhoods, rural outposts.
Because the goal is not profit.
No. The goal is to generate the real-world validation data needed to prove to the public and the medical establishment that this decentralized, patient-centered system can actually protect humanity.
Because ultimately, as the philosophical texts emphasize repeatedly, his ultimate goal is not to conquer diseases in the traditional mechanistic sense.
No, his mission, his dharma, is to liberate people from the fear of disease.
It is to restore their agency, their free will, and their critical intelligence in the face of a terrifying biological threat.
He is basically asking us to stop acting like mechanical intellects and start actually using our intelligence.
So let's just reflect on the incredible journey we've taken in this deep dive. We started by radically redefining what critical thinking actually is.
We moved past the idea of rote memorization and looked at the true power of synthesis.
Tracing it all the way from Charles Darwin's evolutionary insights and magpie genius to Martin Luther King Jr.'s social rebellion, all the way to Dr. Srivatsa's decades-long, grueling fight against institutional conformity in the UK's National Health Service.
We examined the very real, tragic human cost of statistical morality.
We looked at the extreme danger of prioritizing mechanical algorithms, MBA efficiency targets, and institutional self-preservation over individual human lives.
We saw the profound trauma endured by a whistleblower who dared to speak the truth and expose the dharma of the system.
And we stared down the terrifying, mathematically predictable reality of the approaching 2028 antimicrobial resistance crisis.
But most importantly, we explored the antidote.
We looked at why true patient-centered care, empowering you, the individual, with transparent, critically intelligent tools like the Dr. Maya AI and the decentralized self-sterilizing Prima kiosks, might literally be our only viable defense against a wave of untreatable superbugs.
Which brings us to a final thought I really want to leave you with, pulling from the deepest implications of the evolutionary data we reviewed today.
What is it?
Well, the models frame the AMR superbug not just as a pathogen, but as a highly intelligent evolutionary force reacting directly to our misuse of modern medicine.
Right.
If bacteria can adapt, if a single microscopic organism can evolve its own form of biological critical thinking to survive our strongest chemicals and our rigid protocols, the real question is, can human institutions evolve their empathy fast enough to survive the bacteria?
Wow. That is a question that requires all the intelligence and all the critical thinking we can possibly muster. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep looking for the patterns, keep shedding that fear of nonconformity, and keep questioning the systems around you. Until next time.